In this video, we're going to explore the geography of the organ. Now, one reason for filming this course in this church is that it's actually a nice small organ. And if you meet some huge organ, it can be a bit daunting. So let's explore the principles on a fairly small organ. And then if you encounter a larger instrument, it will be less intimidating. So imagine you're coming to the organ for the first time in your life and you're looking at keyboards, which hopefully look quite familiar. They're exactly the same as a piano keyboard, so that's great. But there's very likely to be more than one keyboard. And in England, we call this keyboard here the Great, and the one above it we call the Swell. If there is a third keyboard, it will be down here below the Great, and that's called the choir organ. And if there are four keyboards, then there's another one above the Swell, and that's called the solo organ. Now, in other parts of the world, these keyboards have different names and they're slightly differently ordered sometimes. But let's stick with this because it's often the pattern in many parts of the world. And if you're somewhere else, you'll be able to kind of work out what's happening in your locality. But one thing you've probably noticed already is that, you sit down at the organ. If it's a pipe organ, you'll need to switch the wind on. So there's usually just a little key like there is on this organ, where you just turn it and the wind supply comes in. There might be an on button that you need to press to get the wind up. Obviously, if it's an electronic organ, there'll just be a switch to switch it on. And the first thing you'll notice then is you'll think, well, let's see if I can play something on this organ. You put your hands down on the keys and absolutely nothing happens. Because on the organ, you need to draw some stops. Now, these stops that we have here on both sides of the organ in this case are called draw stops. You literally just draw them out to bring them on, push them back in, to switch them off effectively. And you can use one stop or you can use combinations of stops. And those are the things that produce the sound. So I'm holding onto a chord on the Great. Absolutely nothing is happening. The minute I draw a stop, we've got sound. Put that stop in, draw another, and we've got a different sound, and I can combine those stops. So you won't have any sound until you've drawn stops. But you'll also find that when you're looking at the stops, that each group of stops is associated with one of the keyboards. So you'll notice on this organ that all the stops on this side that we can see at the moment have this word Great written above them. So all of these stops are affecting this lower keyboard, whereas the stops on the other side here are all affecting the upper keyboard. I did say that this is called the Swell. It just so happens that on this beautiful organ built by Scrabble, they call this second keyboard the choir. That's slightly unusual in a UK-US setup, but it doesn't really matter. It's just working out which group of stops have got a label that associate them with a particular keyboard. Then you can find your way around. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more now about what's going on the organ. So besides the keyboards that we've now talked about, obviously on the organ, you also have a pedal board. And that's something that often intimidates people who are not really organists. They're just keyboard players. Well, my advice to you is stick with the label. If you're a keyboard player, then you're not necessarily a pedal board player. So by all means, just ignore the pedals altogether and life will be good. Just one thing to watch out for: if you have stops that are drawn that relate to the pedal board, obviously if you put your feet on something, the notes will sound. So I've got some pedal stops on here. The minute I put my foot on something, obviously you can hear and you can probably see that I've got my foot on a note and it's making a sound. So if you do want to rest your feet on the pedals for any reason, make sure there are no stops that are going to operate on the pedal board. Otherwise, you could be playing with your hands and having some very strange noises going on around it. If you're wanting to kind of experiment with using your feet, and we'll talk more about that during the course, then obviously it's not a bad idea just to realize the pedal board is simply another keyboard, but obviously you're playing it with your feet. So if you want to play something here, it's often the bass line that you play with your feet as an organist. Well, you're just going to use your 2 feet to navigate the pedal board. And you can see in here, it's possible to be quite agile with your feet and move around once you get used to doing it. However, my advice would be not to rush into using your feet, but to kind of be reasonably confident about what you're doing with your fingers. And then if you feel like adding your feet later, well, that's something, as I say, we'll come back to. But that is the pedal board. Now, you might also notice on this organ that there are these funny little buttons. And when I press these buttons, you see they light up as I go. And if I click these, then the lights go off. You see how it's a kind of light on, light off system on this particular organ. Now, these are called pistons. Sometimes they're little buttons that you operate with your feet. Sometimes you'll find them underneath the keyboards. They're called thumb pistons as opposed to the pedal piston system that I've just been showing you. And they have kind of preset combinations of stops. So if you have them on the organ you're playing, they could actually be quite useful, because if you're not entirely sure which stops to use, you could just try pressing one of these thumb pistons that's just literally underneath the keyboard, or press one of these toe pistons and just see which stops come out, which manuals, which keyboards they belong to, and you can experiment and see if that's a sound that you want to work with. So you could use those as pre-selects. Now, the only health warning that comes with this is just be careful that you don't catch something with your thumbs on one of these thumb pistons if the organ's got one, or that you don't sort of lean on one of these toe pistons with a foot and suddenly the whole organ starts blasting forth or something when you're not expecting it to do so. So they're very useful kind of aids for the organist, but they also can be a little bit of a trap if you just kind of come across them without particularly meaning to. So quite useful to know about how those pistons work. On some organs, you have other little buttons around, like this one has got a little button that says C, and it just literally kind of cancels everything that was going on before. So you can just sort of start again. You've got a little button on this organ called S, and that's a setter switch where you can change the combinations of what these pistons are doing. But again, my advice would be don't fiddle around too much with that kind of thing, because if you're a bit of a tech geek, you might think, oh, this is fun. I could start playing with this S button and see what happens. Well, you could end up with all sorts of weird and wonderful things coming across as combinations on your pistons, and you might be best just to inherit the thing as it is and to live with it. So that's a little bit about what's going on with the pedal board and what's going on with these aids, as we call them, these pistons. On some organs, you'll also find there's something called a swell box. Quite often you find there's a swell box. It so happens on this organ there is no swell box. And all it means is that when you're playing on this second keyboard, this upper keyboard of the two, that the pipes for the swell are literally placed inside a box. And the box has shutters on the front of it. And as you close this swell pedal with your foot, the shutters close. And as you open it, the shutters open. So you kind of push it away to open it, and you push it this way to shut it. That means, of course, that because of all those pipes being contained inside a box, as you open the box, you effectively bring about a crescendo. And as you close the box, you effectively bring about a diminuendo. Or you can set different dynamic levels. That doesn't affect the whole organ. If you've got one of those pedals, it will affect the swell organ, that second keyboard. It's very unlikely to affect the grate. There are a few organs around that have a box for the grate as well, but most don't. If you have a third manual choir organ, that might have its own box. And if you've got two boxes, the swell box pedal is normally on the right, the choir box is normally on the left. And if you've got a fourth keyboard that's a solo organ, that might also have its own box. Now, you don't have to worry about boxes. You can just think, too much to take on, let's not bother with boxes. But if you're suddenly thinking, oh, I'm playing on the swell and it's a bit loud, well, you could change the stops, or you could just shut the swell box a little bit, and that might be useful. If you get adventurous and you're doing things on two keyboards, maybe playing a melody on one keyboard and accompanying on the other, well, you could use that swell box just to balance up the sound if you're thinking that the swell maybe is just a bit too loud for that melody that you might be soloing out on the grate. So these are all refinements, but it's good to know what they do. Then you can use them if you want to, and if you're thinking, no, I'm just going to keep this nice and simple, at least you know what they're there for, and again, you don't need to be worried about them, and you can just ignore them. Once again, the health warning is, if you do have a swell box and you put your foot on a swell box to rest on it, and then suddenly you're kind of doing this and shutting the box, don't be surprised if you're playing on the swell and the sound kind of starts disappearing on you as your foot shuts the box. So not a great thing to lean on, particularly with a foot, because of that particular danger. So that's how these bits and bobs work on the organ. Now next, we're going to talk about the stops. So let's now have a look at these stops that happen to be on the left-hand side of the organ in this case. Depending on which organ you're playing, they may be differently located. But it's often the case actually that the grate stops are on the right and the swell stops are on the left. On some organs you have something called tab stops. They're literally just little things that sort of poke up round the top of the keyboards, and you just push it down to bring it on, flick it up to take it off. But those are tab stops. We're dealing with these things called draw stops. So you can see this word choir, and as I explained earlier, just to confuse everybody, in this case we're really talking about this upper keyboard, which is usually called the swell. It just happens to be called the choir in this case. And you can see that if I play a chord on the swell organ, nothing's happening because there are no stops. As soon as I draw a stop, on comes a sound. Now I can add to these stops by putting the next one on. You can hear there's an additional sound. Let's carry on building. So, of course, you can combine these stops in different ways, and some of these sounds you might think are beautiful, and some you might think, oh, that sounds a bit strange. We'll come back and talk more about why that might be in a moment. But just adding stops to each other is a perfectly reasonable way of doing things. So on this organ, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stops belonging to what is here called the choir organ, but is normally called the swell organ. On the pedal organ here, because this is such a small organ, we've only got 2 stops. So we've got this one, and we've got this one. Very different sounds from each other, aren't they? So those are the pedal stops. Now, we have a number of different families of stops to think about, so let me just talk about that for a moment. Basically, you've got stops that are called flutes. So anything that's called flute, there's a big clue, is probably something to do with a flute stop. Or it might be called a piccolo, something like that. So anything that sort of looks a bit fluty is probably a flute stop. So here you might notice we've got a stop here. It's called a Spitz flute. So don't worry if it's kind of got some other name attached to it or it's in some other language, that's fine. It's got this word flute. And a flute sounds like this. It's a very kind of soft, gentle sound. So that's a flute sound. Now, there's another group of stops called diapasons, and I'm going to come back to diapasons a little bit later because we've got examples of them on the other side of this organ. But we've also got one confusing thing. This one here is called a stopped diapason. So you're thinking, haha, it's got the word diapason, so it must be a diapason. But guess what? A stopped diapason is actually a flute. Now, if that's not confusing, I don't know what is. And we could get into some explanation as to why that is, but really, you don't need to worry about it. But when you draw the stopped diapason stop and you play it, you can hear it's a bit like that flute I've just been playing. It's got that kind of fluty sound to it, isn't it? So we've got flutes, we've got diapasons that I'll come back to, and we've got this confusing character called a stop diapason, who's really a flute in disguise. Yippee. We've also got something called reed stops. And this organ has only got one example of it, and it's that rather noisy stop that I was just demonstrating a moment ago on the pedal. Now, anything that looks like the name is a brass instrument or a woodwind instrument that's a bit reedy, so in other words, if it's called trumpet, trombone, tuba, anything like that, or if it's called clarinet or oboe or bassoon or something, on the organ, that will be a reed stop. And the reason for that is it has a little design in the pipes that involves having a reed, and it makes this slightly kind of buzzy sound, and it could be quite a soft, gentle reed, something like a clarinet or an oboe is often quite a gentle sound, but things like trumpets will be a bigger sound. And if you've got an organ that's big enough to have something called a tuba, they're often very big sounds, and some of them will part your hair at 100 meters. So watch out for them. This one is called a bassoon, but you can hear it's kind of got this buzzy, reedy feel. So that's a reed stop. So we've got these different categories. So we've talked about flutes, we've talked about diapasons, we've talked about reeds. There's some other little group of stops called strings, and I'll come back to them in a moment when we look at the stops on the other side as well. But one other thing I want to explain that's quite important if you're coming onto the organ as a non-organist wanting to use stops, because you could sit down at the organ and think, well, I've come to play for Auntie Flo's wedding, and I think I'm going to play the bridal march. So you draw a stop on the swell, I've got the stop diapason, and off you go. Well, that sounds all right, actually, doesn't it? But you might notice that this stop diapason has a number on it. All stops will have a number. And that says 8 on the bottom. And if you look carefully, it will say 8- sometimes, because it means 8 feet. Now, what that actually means is that the pipe for the bottom C on the keyboard is 8 feet long. The stop diapason is a bit of a con, actually, because it has a little stopper in the top of it. So it's only 4 feet long. So the sound resonates up 4 feet, then comes back 4 feet. So you get a sort of 8 foot for the price of a 4 foot stop. But don't worry too much about that. In other words, 8 foot stops are piano pitch. So the bottom C is 8 feet long. As we come up, the pipes get progressively shorter on a pipe organ. So by the time you get to the top notes here, the pipes are actually pretty short affairs. But that's why it's called an 8 foot stop, because that bottom C has a pipe that's 8 feet long. So remember, 8 foot stops are piano pitch. So here you are playing at the wedding, and you're quite happily making a sort of piano pitch sound because you've drawn an 8 foot stop. So what happens if you're at the same wedding, but you decide to pick a stop that says 4 on it? Well, if you've got 8 foot stops at piano pitch 4-foot stops play an octave higher. So let me just demonstrate that 8-foot stop again. Now I'll play exactly the same notes, but on a 4-foot stop. You see what's happened now? The whole thing's an octave higher. So if I choose a 2-foot stop, guess what? It's going to be 2 octaves above piano pitch. That starts sounding a bit strange, isn't it? Because we've gone up in the sky. Now, you might have a 1-foot stop, which would be another octave above that. So it could get a bit ridiculous if you're just using stops that are way above piano pitch. Why do we have all these different pitches? Well, it means that you can kind of add different kind of colors and brightness to the organ by having things at different octaves. So if I draw this 8-foot stop, and I'm playing this at the wedding, and I'm sort of thinking, well, it sounds all right, but maybe it's a bit quiet, a little bit apologetic for the entry of the bride. Well, you could then think, well, what happens if I keep the 8-foot stop on, but add the 4-foot stop to it, so I also have a sound an octave higher? And suddenly you think, oh yeah, that's a bit kind of firmer, isn't it? A bit bolder. Now, if you're thinking, well, yeah, that's better, but I'm still not entirely happy, well, maybe you could have the 8-foot stop, the 4-foot stop, and a 2-foot stop. So we're hearing the same music in 3 different octaves at the same time. And suddenly you're thinking, oh yeah, that's a kind of bolder, brighter sound. So one way you can kind of build sounds on the organ is to build these different pitches by thinking 8-foot pitch is piano pitch, 4's an octave higher, 2's an octave higher than that. You don't have to build it 8, 4, 2. I could, for example, think, well, what happens if I just use this 8-foot stop and a 2-foot stop and I miss out the 4-foot stop? Sounds okay, doesn't it? A lot of things will vary from one organ to another. And this is where you just have to use these things, your ears, to think, well, actually, if I put that stop on, it obliterates everything else. So maybe that's not such a good idea. You'll also, unfortunately, come across many organs where things don't work properly and stops are miles out of tune or some notes are not working. It's best just to kind of explore the organ and find out what actually works best, and just get an idea as to where the really loud stops are, where the really quiet stops are, what kind of matches up with something else. But you can get the idea of how you're building these stops. Now, on the pedals, we've got stops here that have 16 written on them, 16-foot stops. So following the logic that we've already explored, you've probably worked out that this means that something that's at 16-foot pitch is going to play an octave below piano pitch. So the pedals are often based at 16-foot pitch. So if I play this high C on the pedal board, that, believe it or not, is middle C. It doesn't look like middle C because it looks as if it's right at the top of the pedal board, but that is middle C. But if you think about it, if I play middle C at 8-foot pitch, can you see it's an octave higher than this? Because I'm playing this on a 16-foot stop. So an octave below, and the bottom C is really quite a low sound, isn't it? So pedals are based at 16-foot pitch, an octave below the piano pitch. The keyboards, the manuals as we call them, are based at 8-foot pitch, at piano pitch. You will sometimes find on the keyboards that you have stops that are 16-foot pitch, and sometimes that can be quite helpful. If you've got, say, a fairly big sound, you know, you've got some 8-4-2 sound maybe, as we've talked about, and you want to really bolster it and fill out the sound, you can sometimes add a 16-foot, and it can be very effective. But sometimes it kind of muddies things and you think, it's kind of disturbing the clarity of the texture. So again, depends on the individual organ and the combination of stops as to whether the 16-foot is something that bolsters, enhances the sound, or whether it's something that just kind of clogs up the works. One useful thing about 16-foot stops when you have them available for your hands at the keyboards, at the manuals, is that if you're not using your feet because you're a pianist coming to the organ, sometimes adding that 16-foot stop, maybe in the last verse of a hymn or something, can give the sound a bit of depth, and it can almost make people believe that you're using your feet. So, they have their uses if you've got them around. But basically, that's how it works. So if you just relate everything from 8-foot pitch being piano pitch, 4's an octave higher, 2's an octave higher than that, 1's an octave higher than that, 16 is an octave below piano pitch, and sometimes you meet pedal stops that are 32 feet, so that's another octave down. Very occasionally, you'll even meet something that's 64 feet, which is ridiculous, but that's another octave below that, and it usually doesn't do very much except make all the windows shake. But there we are. Those are the different pitches. Now, one other thing you might have noticed is that we've also got these things with kind of fractions on them. 2 2/3. A Nazard, 2 2/3. There's one here called TS, and that's 1 3/5. So, and this is where, if you're a gifted mathematician, you can start working out, well, that's a bit funny, isn't it? Because if 4-foot pitch is an octave above piano pitch, 2-foot pitch is 2 octaves above piano pitch. Well, 2 2/3 must be somewhere between the octaves. Does that make sense? Well, you're absolutely right. Let me play middle C on this 8-foot stop. Now, hear it on the 4-foot stop, an octave higher. Now hear it on this 2 2/3. Can you see what's happened? It's jumped up 1 octave and a 1/5. So, if I play this little scale, or part of a scale, I'm playing C, D, E, F, G. If I play it on this Nazard, it's coming up an octave and a 1/5 higher. G, A, B, C, D. So you're thinking, oh, this is cool. Is this some kind of transpose switch or something? No, it's not meant to do that at all. It's meant to add a bit of colour to the sound. Now, on a good organ, these things are voiced very carefully. In other words, the way that the voicer has worked with the pipes in the factory in the first place is designed to kind of blend in with the things that are playing at the right pitch, so it adds a bit of colour. In other words, it shouldn't dominate so much that you think, I'm absolutely kind of hearing this sound going an octave and a 1/5 higher than everything else. It's just there to colour it. So you wouldn't ever use that stop on its own. This is an important thing. So don't sit down at the organ and think, oh, I think I'll play Here Comes the Bride on this Nazard. Well, it's sort of all right, but it's a bit high, isn't it? And it's a 1/5 away from the pitch that you're playing in. However, if you decide that, you tried the 8-foot, and you thought, that's all right, let's add the 4-foot. And you thought, yeah, that's a bit better. Maybe I could add the Nazard to that. Now, the funny thing is, you think that that couldn't possibly work. How could you have 2 stops playing in B flat major and another stop playing in F major? Wouldn't that just be a kind of catastrophic mess? But because these pipes are so beautifully voiced on this organ, you can hear that when I put that Nazard in there, that 2 2/3 stop, it just adds colour to the sound, doesn't it? Similarly, this TS is quite a high one, 1 3/5. So remember, 8-foot's piano pitch, 4-foot's an octave higher, 2-foot's an octave higher than that, 1-foot's an octave higher than that. So this 1 3/5 must be playing somewhere between octaves. So let's see what's going on. If I play C on that, can you hear that I've now got a high E sounding when I play that C? So again, you wouldn't use the tierce on its own. It's very kind of crazily high, and again in the wrong key. However, if I had, say, an 8-foot and a 4-foot sound, and I wanted to put the tierce on, you see how it's adding a new colour to the sound, a kind of brightness. And you might like that sound, or you might think, no, I think I prefer something else. The great thing is, when it comes to stops, as the organist, you've got plenty of choice as to what you're going to use. That's entirely your call. And at the end of the day, as I say, use your ears and think, does that sound good or does it sound a bit weird? If it sounds weird, try and come up with something else. But these are the basic principles on which these pitches work. Anything that has one of these fraction things, 2 2/3, 1 3/5, any of that kind of stuff, these are called mutation stops. You don't need to know this or remember it, but it's just there for information. Those are called mutation stops. Okay, now I want to work round to the other side and just talk about some other additional features that relate to stops on the right-hand side of the organ. When we were looking at those stops on the left-hand side of the organ, on this particular organ, we noticed there was only one 8-foot stop. We had an 8-foot stop, then a 4-foot stop, and it kind of built up from there. As we're looking at the right-hand side, all these stops, you'll notice, belong to the great organ, so the lower keyboard. We find actually we've got more 8-foot stops. These are sometimes called foundation stops. They're kind of the foundation of the organ sound, these stops working at piano pitch. And, you know, it's a good chance to explore the fact that some might be flutes, some might be diapasons, some might be reeds, and there'll be different sort of volumes for each of these as well. So some of these might be quite hefty characters, some of them might be quite gentle. So, for example, here's an 8-foot stop on the great, and it's really quite a small sound, isn't it? Here's a slightly bigger sound. Still quite small, but a little bit bigger than the last one. Here's another 8-foot stop that's a bit bigger still. So it's quite helpful when you have a choice of these foundation stops at piano pitch that you can find the appropriate thing for the occasion. For example, if you're unfortunate enough to have to officiate at the organ at somebody's funeral, you might find the funeral begins with the vicar, the priest, whatever, the minister, saying a few sentences from the Bible as the coffin is brought into the church. And then you might be expected to play while that's happening, but you need to be playing very quietly, otherwise people won't be able to hear what's being said. Or you could get into one of these awful kind of almost comic situations, which maybe you don't want at someone's funeral, where you're making too much noise at the organ and the poor vicar, priest or minister is shouting at the top of his or her voice to be heard. So you're going to have to find some 8-foot sound that's quite gentle. So something like that would probably do the job quite well, wouldn't it? But if you're going to accompany a church full of people singing hymns, well, that's probably slightly gentle, isn't it? It's not going to give them the confidence to sing out. So you'll be looking for maybe this slightly more hefty 8-foot stop. It's going to kind of build on something a bit more solid. Now, we've got these different kind of sounds. I did say I was going to come back to talk about string sounds. Now, on the organ, we have these quiet stops that are called strings. They have different names. Sometimes you find the name solitional or gamba, and then you'll find something else called a vox angelica, you know, angelic voices, or a voix celeste, a celestial voice. You see where these lovely names come from. And on this organ, we've got this thing called a gemshorn, could be a solitional or a gamba, quite a gentle sound. And then we've got this sound. On this organ, it's called a voce humana, so human voice, as it were. And the two stops together sound like this. And you might think that sounds slightly out of tune. It is, and it's designed to be so. So we have this sound. If I hold onto this chord and switch the stops, can you hear what's happened? It's just gone very slightly sharp on the other one. And then it drops down again, slightly sharp, slightly flatter. Put them together, and you have this kind of gentle throbbing of being slightly out of tune. So it's not that the organ is out of tune, it's designed to be that way. And so these strings, as we call them, are really quite a nice, you know, sort of sound for kind of a gentle impact or if you want to accompany a sound on a different keyboard. So say I want to do something like this, use these strings to accompany this. You can hear that it's quite an effective accompaniment sound. So that's the strings. And as I say, you've got a lovely choice of 1, 2, 3 8-foot stops on the grate on this organ. Then we have this thing called a principal 4-foot. Well, a principal is a diapason stop, but often when it's at 4-foot pitch, we call it a principal. So obviously being at 4-foot pitch, it's an octave above piano pitch. And it's got that kind of diapason sound. When I put it with the 8-foot diapason, I've got diapasons 8 and 4. And you can feel that's quite a robust sound, isn't it? So that's a useful kind of sound if you're accompanying a congregation singing. If you had something called a 15th at 2-foot pitch, well, that would also be a diapason sound. And we've got a 15th on the left-hand side of this organ, but we haven't on the right-hand side. Doesn't really matter. We've also got this funny looking thing at the top, and it's called mixture. And then you notice it's got Roman numerals underneath, and it says 3-4 in Roman numerals. Well, one thing's for sure, you're never going to want to use any kind of mixture stop or any stop with Roman numerals on its own. That's a very peculiar sound, isn't it? We talk about these as ranks. So if it says 3 to 4, it's a 3 to 4 rank mixture, which actually means that some notes have 3 different pipes at 3 different pitches, all sounding at the same time. So even though I'm just playing middle C, I've got more than 1 pipe sounding. So I've either got 3 pipes or 4 pipes sounding, depending on which notes I'm playing on that mixture. So you never use a mixture on its own. It doesn't make any sense. But a mixture will add a lot of brightness to other sounds. So say, for example, we're going to use this open diapason that we talked about a moment ago, at 8-foot pitch, and then I decide to add the 4-foot principal. And then I think I really want to bolster the sound, I'll add a mixture. So it's a kind of pretty bold sound then. So, you know, for a loud verse of a hymn, or if you're at the wedding playing, well, that could be a good resounding sound for a bride to and groom to leave the church while you're playing. So mixtures adding kind of height of sound, high pitches and brightness to the sound. You might notice on this organ, we've also got a funny customer called a tremulant. If you try to play while the tremulant is drawn, absolutely nothing will happen. But you may just hear a slight kind of throbbing sound, and it's just kind of wavering the wind supply a bit. So when I have the tremulant on with one of the stops, the sound just kind of wavers a bit. Can you hear that slight kind of vibrato, if you like, on the organ? So the tremulant is the kind of organist's vibrato. So this tremulant just works with these stops on the grate. You may have a tremulant with a swell. So if you want to have that particular effect, there it is. If you've got lots of stops out, you probably don't want to have the tremulant throbbing away. But if you're using a quiet stop, a tremulant might be quite nice. Lots of tremulants are a bit heavy duty, I have to say. And if it kind of goes, whoa, 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 you probably don't want to use it very much. It just sounds as if somebody's put their fingers in the electric supply. But if they're subtle, like this one is, then that's great. And by the way, I did talk about the on-off switch. Well, you can see at the bottom of the grate is just this little key, and you just turn that to switch the organ on or off. Every organ has its own kind of system for doing that. And that really introduces us to these stops. So you're thinking you've got flutes, diapasons and reeds, you've got 8-foot stops at piano pitch, you're going up an octave, 4-foot, another octave, 2-foot, another octave, 1-foot, going down an octave from piano pitch to 16-foot stops. Then you've got these mutations, the things with fractions, and then you've got things with mixtures. So I hope this is now giving you some idea what these stops are, how you might use them. And even if you're playing a huge organ with 4 keyboards and lots of stops, these are the things, these are the families and the kind of pitches you're going to meet. And that's just a little guide in how you might go about using them. We're going to do some work kind of looking at various different pieces that as a pianist you might be able to play on the organ quite comfortably, and think about which stops and combinations of stops might work. But at the moment, it's just taking away the fear factor and enabling you to think, great, I can play the piano, I can now sit at the organ, know that this is the great, this is the swell, these are the stops of the great, these are the stops of the swell, I've got some stops of the pedals, I'm probably not going to use them, but they're there if I want them. I've got an idea about these pistons, I've got an idea about a swell box if I see one. So you basically know your way around the organ.